Now, for the MyPad World app for the iPad, we want the user to be able to change the settings in a modal dialog. So we want to set up a modal view. And now that we've added the code to use those preference settings in the main view, we are all set to set up this modal view. And here we are at MyPad World. Now, one reason why it's easy to extend and enhance an iPad app is the fact that the template sets you up to take advantage of delegation. Now, you remember what delegation is. You're using a behavior-rich object supplied by the framework as is, and you're putting the code for the program-specific behavior in a separate object, a delegate object. You're basically using delegation to get the framework object to do the work for you. Now, we're going to use delegation to create the modal view, which is a child window, pretty much like a dialog in Mac OS X, that appears on top of the parent window. And it requires the user to interact with it before returning to the parent window. Now, this modal dialog will appear when the user taps the light info button. Now, as you recall, in our main view controller, MyPad World View Controller implementation file, if you click on here, you see that we have the controls section that we put in. We put in a placeholder for the settings method. So this is the method that we will connect to the light info button. It's an action method using the IB action qualifier. We will use Interface Builder to specify that when the user taps the light info button, the target is the MyPad World View Controller object, and the method to invoke is this one, settings. And this is yet another example of the target action pattern. And of course, in the settings, the idea is to enable the user to enter his or her own words for the following words animation, as well as change the speed of the animation. For these functions to work, we need to enable the app to save data entered by a user for the next time he or she fires up the app. Now, we recently added code that uses these preference settings in the app to animate the view. But now we find out how to save data entered by the user using a modal controller that displays a view, a modal view. And so we're going to end up creating another view controller and use the inherited methods of the UI view controller superclass to implement the modal view that the user can use to enter text and change the animation speed. Because we've encapsulated the details of how to set the following words and speed, it's a piece of cake to add code for setting and saving user preference settings. Now, you've encountered modal views before. Whenever you had to click OK in a dialog to allow Mac OS X or an application workflow to continue. A modal view provides self-contained functionality in the context of the current task or workflow. Think of it as a child window that requires the user to interact with it before returning to the parent window. As you can see, Flipboard uses a modal view for its settings. And you have to actually tap the Done button, just as you would on a flip side view in the iPhone app. You actually have to tap the Done button to get back to the main window. A modal view interrupts the workflow, but if the context shift is clear and temporary, like it is here, so that the user doesn't lose sight of the main task, a modal view can be the most agreeable way to offer the ability to change these kinds of settings. As a design goal, you keep your tasks in a modal view fairly short and narrowly focused. You don't want your users to experience a modal view as a mini application within your app. So you want to avoid creating a modal task that involves a hierarchy of modal views, because people can get lost and forget how to retrace their steps. Really, all you really need to do is provide everything in one modal view and provide an obvious and safe way to exit that modal view, such as the Done button on the upper right corner there. And my goal with MyPad World is to display a modal view over the animated view when the user taps the light info button. And in that modal view, the user can enter text to replace the existing text for following words and drag a speed slider for the speed value. The user can then tap a Done button to gracefully exit the modal view. We're going to add these interface elements to the modal view using, you guessed it, Interface Builder. But first, we need to create a new view controller for the modal view, which we're going to call Settings View Controller. A modal view, just like the animated main view, is accessed by a subclass of UI View Controller. Here we are back at the MyPad World app, and what we want to do is select MyPad World, the group that contains all of the header and implementation files, and we're going to create a new view controller. So in order to do that, we've selected this and we choose File, New, New File. The Choose a Template dialog appears, which always happens when you choose New File. We want to choose Cocoa Touch on the left side here under the iOS heading. So we'll select UI View Controller subclass, which is what we want to select to create a new view controller. As you can see, it tells us what it is, an Objective-C class, which is a subclass of UI View Controller with a header file which includes a UI kit header and an optional XIB interface file. So now we click the Next button. In the subclass of pop-up menu, we're going to keep it set to UI View Controller because we're creating a subclass of it. We are targeting it for the iPad, and we're going to now include the XIB for the user interface, the nib file. That way, the nib file is created along with the view controller file. So we click Next, and now we get to name that class, that subclass. And we've decided to call it Settings View Controller. It already has a .m for the method implementation file, and it's going to create the .h header file for us. It's going to be placed in the group MyPad World, and it's going to be added to the target MyPad World. So we click Save. And here we find our Settings View Controller.h, Settings View Controller.m, and Settings View Controller.xib. We don't really have to do this, but since they fall below the supporting files folder, which we can close, we want to move them up to here so that they are grouped together with the MyPad World View controller. And we can open supporting files so we can see everything we're using here. Settings View Controller.h has what it needs to set up the view, declaring it. Settings View Controller.m has the methods. We now have a bare bones view controller for the modal view called Settings View Controller. Coming up, we're going to modify the code and the interface in Interface Builder in order to customize our modal view.